The sea lay hushed beneath a sky the color of early pearl, its surface breathing in a slow, unhurried rhythm that matched the distant pulse of the moon. Before we begin, I would love to know where in the world you are listening from, and what's the time there. Let us know in the comments. Thank you so much for being the part of my community. Let's get started. No chart marked these waters yet. No keel had broken them into wakes. Only the wind whispered across low swells, and the gulls, thin, white brushstrokes against the pale horizon, circled in easy spirals before drifting north toward dawn. Beneath that quiet film of water, the world opened wider than any plain, a cathedral of drifting green where kelp ribbons reached upward like sunlit banners. Far below the reach of storms, the earth's own heartbeat hummed through volcanic bone, steady and deep, and every creature that moved in this liquid dusk carried that same measured cadence in flesh and fin. Time itself seemed looser here, as though the turning of seasons had not yet found a rhythm strict enough to hurry things along. In the lull of early summer, the water ran clear, so clear that shafts of sunlight poured down unbroken, stirring gold dust from the sand and layering every contour of rock in rippling shades of amber. Small gray crabs picked their way over barnacled ledges. Lantern-shelled pteropods drifted like forgotten petals. A cloud of herring silvered the shallows only to vanish again, flashing bright before dissolving into blue. High above, the surface flashed glassy white when a puffin skimmed low, wingtips shearing beads that tumbled backward like shattered glass, and then the sea settled once more, as though even that fleeting disturbance were too much clamor for this gentle corner of the earth. Here, at the ragged edge of what would someday be called the Komandorski Islands, a herd of beings moved with such patience that they might have been mistaken for drifting logs. They were vast, heavy-boned creatures, each longer than 3 grown men and thick as ancient oaks. Their hides were gray-brown, mottled where kelp fronds brushed them clean, and laced with scars rubbed smooth over years of tidal grazing. Later ages would name them Steller's sea cows, but in this first morning they were simply there, breathing, grazing, living, part of the seafloor's slow language. Their lungs filled in long, even draws. Their hearts beat slow enough to be mistaken for silence. Kelp forests unfurled in rust and jade columns around them, swaying, not with urgency, but with the languid poise of dancers lost in their own reverie. The sea cows loved these places the way mountains love snow, wholly, without needing to define the affection. Where the stems rose thickest, they leaned their wide, bristled lips forward and nipped the tender leaves, chewing with that sleepy deliberation born of endless time. A single mouthful might last a minute. A single meal might meander across hours. A single day was nothing more than one tide's gentle turning into the next. No predator troubled them here. Orcas roamed farther seaward, preferring quicker prey. Hunters on land had not yet dreamed of crossing these iron-gray straits. So the herd drifted, half asleep, draped in sunlight, buoyed by blubber thick as winter bark. Calves, small only by the herd's large measure, balanced near their mother's flanks, noses rising now and then to sip at the air before sinking back into the cradle warmth of salt water. The calves' eyes were glossy and dark, reflecting the braided green above, and through those eyes the world appeared boundless, benevolent, slow. Sound traveled here in velvet threads. From somewhere far beyond the continental shelf, a bowhead whale loosed its long, bell-like call, and the note slid through the water until kelp thickets softened it into a warm vibration against each sea cow's broad rib cage. Closer still, the sea's breath crackled where ice sheets, left over from a winter already half forgotten, rubbed against one another, sighing like ancient doors. Even wind had a softened voice, It combed the surface into low, rounded hills that rose and fell, with a hush reminiscent of sleeping lungs. In this soundscape, the sea cows found a quiet kinship. The deep note of whale, the chime of ice, the distant gull, their own slow heartbeat. Each a tone, each a syllable, woven into an ever-turning lullaby. Seasons drifted by, not as markers of urgency, but as subtle shifts in tint and taste. In midsummer, the water warmed enough to coax new ribbons of kelp from holdfast to surface, fresh, sweet, and green as crushed basil, and the herd ranged slowly north, following flavor more than temperature. As autumn whispered in, storms laced the sky with iron-gray cloudbanks. Lightning flickered but seldom struck, and rain fell straight as threads, cold but not cruel. The sea cows answered with deeper dives, browsing where kelp held strongest, rolling in sand to scrape barnacles from thick hides. Winter, when it arrived, came not with drama but with a long fading of light, each day trimmed by a breath until darkness ruled more hours than sun. Kelp slumbered low, and the herd drifted to sheltered coves whose shallows never fully froze, where seagrass meadows offered a modest feast beneath skim ice thin as glass. During one such winter, an older female settled into the quiet of a moonless night, her breath puffing ivory clouds that twirled upward like ghostly ribbons before melting back into salt air. She was heavy with new life, carrying the promise of another calf in the slow tide of her blood. Whenever she surfaced, the stars reflected in her eyes, pinprick fires mirrored in dark pools, and each exhale steamed across the water before fading into constellations of icy dust. Around her, others rested nose to tail, floating logs upon a midnight pond, bodies rocking, with the hush-hush of small waves slapping kelp. Time held its breath. From that darkness the ocean's deepest hush pressed in, felt rather than heard, and for a while all the world seemed to be listening, to the distant crackle of forming ice, to the soft rasp of baleen whales far off in migration, to the unborn heartbeat thrumming within that matron's core. When spring again uncurled like a green ribbon, pale skeins of light shimmered across the sky in auroral veils, pink, jade, silver, and the sea cows watched the heaven's silent dance mirrored upon the sea. They did not wonder at the physics or the magnetics. They simply existed beneath the glowing curtains, lantern-lit giants gliding through waters tinted by celestial fire. Ice loosened its grip. Fresh meltwater carried silt from still snowy islands, tinting the shallows in strokes of coffee cream. And with the thaw came kelp buds, tender and gold at their tips, sweet as orchard fruit to sea cow palate. The herd pressed closer to shore, half rolling over one another in slow delight, nibbling each frond until sunlight traced the curves of their massive backs. Life here was a loop, sun, storm, ice, thaw, yet never did it feel repetitive. Each winter's hunger, each summer's feast, each calf's first gasp of air, each matriarch's final sigh, all of it folded into the sea's boundless story like quiet beats within a larger pulse. And because everything moved so gently, endings never felt abrupt. They dissolved, like rain sinking through sea foam, nurturing the next beginning. Bones fell to sand and grew gardens of coral. Kelp leaves nibbled to stumps rose anew. Snow that buried the coast melted to feed fresh blooms of plankton. In this place, loss was simply another texture of presence. Even so, the sea itself carried memories deeper than any graveyard. Sunken valleys filled with the petrified trunks of kelp forests long gone. In hidden canyons, whale skeletons lay draped in pale sponges, their ivory vertebrae turned into houses for shy eelpout. And far beneath the herd's languid domain, volcanic vents exhaled mineral steam as though the earth herself sleep-talked, recounting old dreams of fire and salt. The sea cows felt none of this consciously, yet in the slow cadence of their hearts there stirred an ancient recognition that they, too, belonged to this endless remembering. On a clear day, midway through yet another gentle summer, the water shivered with reflections of sky so blue it seemed to ring like crystal. The horizon stretched seamless, a flawless arc separating two shades of azure. The darker mass below, the lighter above, while in the middle floated those broad-backed shapes grazing in the lazy choreographies. The matron was there, heavy still, her sides swelling with each deliberate breath. The calf she carried shifted, pushing against the thick wall of her womb, and the mother rose a fraction, allowing sunlight to bathe her spine in bronze. It warmed her hide, coaxing microalgae into tiny blossoms of emerald across her skin, a living cloak that glimmered as the water flexed. Small fish darted in to nibble those green specks. She did not mind. Symbiosis was as natural as breathing. Everything fed something. Everything gave something, and the world spun on in effortless balance. That afternoon, clouds slid in from the west, brushed silvery lace across the sun, and exhaled a mist so fine it seemed woven of light. The sea flattened, reflecting the sky's new pewter hue. Kelp ribbons darkened, their blades swishing like robes in slow procession. The herd's breathing became the dominant sound, a rolling syncopation that drifted across the hush. Inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale, soft as wool across stone. When dusk arrived, the air smelled faintly of iodine and rain-kissed sand. Gulls tucked their beaks beneath wings atop wave-worn boulders. Foxes cried somewhere inland, and the matron, sensing rhythms older than any season, felt the first deep contraction ripple through her. Night unfurled fully then, a velvet cloak lit by scattered sparks. Starlight danced in fragments atop gentle sloshing, and the aurora, subtle tonight, quivered like a silent chorus behind thin cirrus veils. The mother sea cow drifted toward a cove whose mouth opened between two dragon-back cliffs, their flanks streaked with moonstone quartzes that caught the faint light. The water here lay shallower, calmer, the kelp shorter but sweet. Around her, two younger females glided close, instinct guiding them to act as midwives, though no ceremony named them so. In the hush, they brushed against her sides, lending warmth, reading each muscle tremor as though it were a line of ancient script. Deep below, the calf turned again, guided by tides older than language. In that turning lay promise, a first breath soon, a first nuzzle against the surface, a first taste of kelp leaf still sun-warm at dawn. And yet, before those moments could arrive, there remained the final hush of gestation, the last long dream inside the womb, where the calf heard nothing but the murmur of mother's heart and the distant rumble of waves against hidden reef. Outside, the sea stilled even further until each star had its twin upon the mirror below. The only motion came from the slow slide of the birthing mother's fluke, sweeping tiny crescents of phosphorescence that trailed after her like moonlit lace. She circled once, twice, 3 times within the cove, feeling the pulse of water cradle her swollen belly. Another contraction passed. The two companions drifted closer still, their breaths forming wreaths in the cooling night. There was no urgency, only certainty. The universe had no concept of haste here. It measured things not in seconds, but in heartbeats of stone and tide. Far beyond the cliffs, winds picked at waves, hurting them east toward lands unseen. On those distant shores, forests trembled, rivers swelled, and creatures alien to these waters made their own quiet journeys. But none of that mattered within this sheltered hollow. Here, the sea whispered one simple instruction: wait. And so they waited. Rocks, kelp, tide, moon, mother. Waited while the unborn calf stretched in the shrinking dusk of its ocean cradle, waited while the night deepened toward cool indigo, waited while the first hints of dawn stirred just beneath the horizon in tones of roseash and violet. If one listened closely, one might have heard the oldest stories of water slip through that cove. The memory of glaciers carving fjords, of continents trembling open, of volcanic mountains exhaling ash into seas that sighed and swallowed and stilled again. In those stories, everything that ever lived became sediment, then stone, then sand, then plankton, then life once more. Already the calf belonged to that great circle. Already its bones and hide and breath were notes in a vast, eternal score. The mother, knowing this in ways beyond thought, relaxed one giant fin and let herself float belly up for a moment, buoyed by her own immense peace, belly rounded and moonlit beneath the stars. Before long, a faint glow gathered in the east, soft as a whispered promise. The sky tinted like the inside of a shell, blush at first, then gold. Water answered with shimmering reflections, and every drop of spray turned to flecks of light. In that growing luminescence, the matron's companions lifted their heads, exhaling twin plumes that rose in quicksilver arcs before melting back into air. The tide, having waited all night, began at last to turn, tugging outward, drawing the cove's water toward the open sea in a sigh. Kelp fronds leaned with the gentle pull, sands stirred in fine clouds. A gull cried once, sharp, lonely, then fell quiet. With the turn of that first tide, the calf inside its mother stirred again, responding to unseen moons, to shifting water, to the hush of dawn. Another contraction rippled through her frame, but she did not fight it. She let it crest and fade. One more contraction followed, quicker, stronger, leaving her belly taut as stone. She rolled gently, fluke slicing through glass-smooth water, the edges of her hide lit by fire-opal dawn. Those witnessing companions drifted to either side, calm as dusk. In the hush between contractions, wind pushed new light across the sea. It framed the cliffs in molten lines, traced clouds in rose gold, set every bead of foam ablaze. The matron's breathing grew deeper, weightier, carrying within each exhalation the last traces of carrying life and the first breath of giving it forth. A third contraction rose. She arched her back and the water broke around her, scattering starlight remnants into the kelp. Somewhere deeper in the cove, the first push of the tide pulled at seagrass roots. Just as the sun's first rim kissed the horizon, she felt the threshold approach, the place where womb ends and world begins. The calf pressed downward, turning nose toward light. A hush fell even deeper, as though every gull, fox, crab, and rock sensed the moment's weight and held its voice. And then, there we pause. The mother's body arcs in labor, the calf poised at the gate of dawn, the companions endlessly patient, the sea cradling all three in breathless stillness. The first tide of a new life begins its gentle inward pull, but its story will unfurl in the next telling. Ask ChatGPT. The first light of morning touched the cove like a secret shared in whispers, sliding over the cliffs and spilling in molten ribbons across the still water. The tide had turned in the night, and with it came the slow, inevitable summons to begin. The matron sea cow floated in the cradle of kelp and quiet, flanked by her two companions, their vast bodies rocking gently in the low swell. The air was cool enough to cloud each breath, and the faint salt mist rising from the sea carried the scent of wet stone and iodine. Somewhere beyond the headland, a lone gull called, its voice sharp but thin, quickly swallowed by distance. The contractions rolled through her in waves, each one swelling and subsiding with the rhythm of the water itself. There was no fear here, no hurry. The sea had done this before, countless times for countless mothers. She only had to yield to it, to let the tide and her body speak the same language. The two companions pressed close when the swell of effort came, their sides warm against hers, their deep heartbeats a steady, grounding pulse. In the hush between labor's peaks, they drifted together, kelp brushing against their flanks like soft banners, the fronds swaying in slow applause for the life about to arrive. A final deep push came with the sun's full ascent, and then, suddenly, there was weightlessness where heaviness had been. A small shape slid into the water, its hide darker, softer, still glistening with the warmth of the womb. For a moment it floated, curled, eyes closed, body swaying gently in the forgiving embrace of the sea. Then the mother's great head lowered, and she nudged it upward with a tenderness as deliberate as the dawn. The calf broke the surface, and its first breath came in a quick, sharp gasp, followed by a thin exhale that fogged the air and dissolved into the wind. The companions lingered nearby, watching. Their heads lifted in unison, nostrils flaring as if to mark the scent of this new life. The mother circled her calf once, twice, brushing it with her flippers, guiding it toward her side. The little one pressed close, still blinking against the brightness of morning. The first touch of kelp brushed its face, and it flinched, not in fear, but in the startled awareness of texture and taste. Soon it would come to love that tang of green, but for now it sought only warmth, the steady rise and fall of its mother's breaths. The cove was still, but not silent. The water held a constant murmur, the sigh of waves folding into sand, the distant crackle of ice melting in the sun, the muffled chatter of crabs scuttling over rock. Beneath it all was a deeper, slower voice, the sea itself moving in its ancient patterns. The calf listened, its tiny ears twitching with each new vibration. When its mother shifted to breathe, the calf followed, its own small nostrils breaking the surface. It was clumsy at first, its tail swaying wide to keep balance, but instinct guided it well. The day passed in a haze of drifting light. The mother and calf floated together in the sunlit shallows, the companions slowly circling them in loose arcs, warding off any curious seal or approaching shadow. Though danger was rare here, the instinct to protect was woven deep. The calf nursed for the first time, its mouth finding the warmth of milk, and the world narrowed to the taste of nourishment and the sound of its mother's slow heartbeat. Each swallow was a promise. You are safe, you are fed, you are part of something that will carry you forward. Outside the cove, life continued with its own gentle pace. Kittiwakes wheeled and dipped over the open water, their wings catching glints of sun like flecks of silver. A pair of puffins, beaks bright with the season's colors, paddled along the kelp edge, their comical nodding making ripples that shimmered like coins dropped into a fountain. Farther out, a whale breached once, its massive body rising like a mountain from the depths before falling back with a sound like the clap of a great drum. The splash rolled into the cove as a gentle rocking swell, lifting mother and calf together, cradling them in rhythm. The calf began to explore by afternoon. Still clinging to its mother's side, it drifted a little farther with each small kick of its tail. It brushed the kelp again, this time nibbling at the tip of a frond. The taste was strange, bitter and green, touched with the mineral flavor of the sea, but it chewed a moment before letting the fragment drift away. There would be time for feeding later. For now, its hunger was for milk, for the shadow of its mother above, for the steady comfort of touch. The companions did not stray far. Now and then, one would dive, its vast bulk vanishing into the green gloom below. Minutes later, it would rise again, its back gleaming with threads of sunlight and dotted with droplets that slid away into the sea. They would glide close to the calf, brushing it gently, as if reminding it that it was part of something larger than itself. A herd, a lineage, a pattern as old as the tide. As evening lowered itself across the sky, the light turned liquid gold, pooling in the troughs between waves. The cliffs burned briefly with that glow, their stone faces streaked with fire before the sun slipped lower, casting the cove into deep blues and soft shadows. The calf stayed close to its mother, nursing again, its small body shivering slightly as the air cooled. The mother breathed in long, steady pulls, her eyes half-lidded, her body swaying with the rhythm of the tide. Night came slowly. Stars emerged one by one, their reflections doubling the heavens upon the water's surface. The aurora's faint veil wove itself across the northern horizon, pale green fading into silver, its movement as slow as breath. The calf lifted its head once to look, though it did not yet know what it was seeing. The mother pressed close, and they floated together in that quiet spectacle, the companions drifting at a respectful distance. Somewhere deep in the calf's bones, though it could not name it yet, there was an understanding. The sea was vast, but it was also home. The kelp was shelter, the tide a steady companion, the herd an unbroken circle around which life flowed. In the days to come it would learn the feeding grounds, the safe coves, the paths of the currents. It would feel storms pass overhead, hear the call of distant whales, see the seasons turn the water from silver to slate to emerald. But tonight there was only this, the warmth of its mother, the slow rocking of the tide, and the kelp shadows swaying in the dark. And beyond the cove, unseen but already moving toward this world, changes began to stir, shifts in wind and current, in creatures that hunted the sea, in shadows that would grow longer with each turning season. But for now, the calf slept, and the sea kept watch. Morning broke softly over the cove, not with a blaze of light, but with a slow unfurling. Gray lifting to silver, silver melting into a pale gold that pooled on the water's skin. The tide was high, and the kelp forest swayed in their full length, their wide blades rippling just beneath the surface. From above, they were no more than dark ribbons curling lazily in the current, but beneath, they opened into a vast meadow, alive with shifting color and motion. The calf woke in the cradle of its mother's side, eyes blinking open to the sight of sunlight streaming down in long, rippling shafts. Each beam quivered where it struck the kelp, scattering into patterns of gold and jade. Tiny fish, no longer than a kelp leaf's width, darted in and out of the fronds, each movement sending a shimmer through the water. The air above was calm, but here below the surface, the world was in constant, graceful motion. Kelp bending, fish swirling, sand lifting and falling in the faint pull of the tide. The herd moved together toward deeper water, the companions gliding ahead, their massive bodies parting the forest of kelp with the ease of river stones dividing a stream. The mother followed, the calf at her flank, still a little unsure in the shifting light. Now and then a frond would brush its face, and it would flinch, its tiny whiskers twitching at the tickle. But curiosity began to outpace hesitation, and soon it was nudging the fronds with its bristled lips, feeling the slippery smoothness, nibbling at the edges in playful, clumsy bites. The meadow spread far beyond what the calf could see. Kelp fronds rooted deep in the rocky seabed rose upward, like tall, swaying pillars, some reaching the surface and laying broad leaves flat in the sunlight, others cut short by grazing or storm. Small crabs climbed the stalks with deliberate steps, pausing to tuck themselves into crevices when shadows passed overhead. Sea urchins clung low to the holdfasts, spines bristling, while starfish, slow, deliberate, and unhurried, crept in pastel constellations along the rocks. It was a world that had existed for generations beyond counting, each tide renewing its quiet abundance. For the sea cows, the kelp forest was more than food. It was shelter from the open sea, a place where currents slowed and predators rarely ventured. It muffled the noise of storms, hid the herd from the eyes of distant hunters, and offered grazing that never quite disappeared, even in the lean months of winter. Here, the calf would learn the slow, deliberate art of feeding, how to grasp the base of a blade with its lips, tug gently to break it free, chew in unhurried bites until the leaf was gone, and then drift onward to the next. By mid-morning, sunlight poured more deeply into the forest, and the water shimmered with warmth. The calf watched the way its mother fed, the way her wide lips gathered the kelp, her head tilting slightly to pull the thickest fronds. When it tried to mimic her, it found its grip weak, the frond slipping free to sway away in the current. The mother waited, patient, before guiding it toward softer growth, where the leaves broke easily and the taste was sweeter. The calf chewed its first real mouthful, and for the first time its hunger eased not with milk, but with the taste of the sea's green gift. Beyond the herd, other lives wove through the kelp. A harbor seal appeared at the meadow's edge, its sleek body cutting through the water in a flash of silver. It paused, hovering a few body lengths away, its wide eyes curious. The calf turned to watch, and for a moment the two hung suspended in the green light, studying one another. Then the seal flicked its tail and vanished into the maze of fronds, its shadow slipping away like a thought before it could be caught. The day moved with the tide. As the water rose and fell, the light shifted, pooling in some places, fading in others. In the afternoon, the herd drifted toward the far edge of the meadow, where the kelp thinned and the seafloor opened into broad sandbanks. Here, the sunlight blazed more directly, turning the water to liquid amber. The calf swam a little ahead, testing its strength, its flukes stirring spirals of sand that drifted upward before settling again. The mother followed, keeping close, her shadow always within reach. Rest came easily here. The herd floated in the sunlit shallows, heads rising now and then to breathe, bodies swaying with the gentle push and pull of the current. The calf nestled against its mother's side, half asleep, lulled by the warmth and the sound of the sea moving through the kelp. Overhead, gulls wheeled, their shadows flickering briefly over the water, and far beyond the meadow's edge, the sound of waves breaking against the outer rocks reached them as a distant, steady heartbeat. Evening brought a change in the light. The sun slipped lower, turning the green meadows to deep bronze, and the water took on a hush as the wind softened. The herd began the slow journey back toward the cove, the calf swimming more steadily now, staying close but no longer pressed tight to its mother. Behind them, the meadow swayed in the fading light, its fronds whispering in the current like fields of grass stirred by a passing breeze. The calf looked back once, its dark eyes lingering on the vast green world it was only beginning to know. It did not yet understand that these meadows had cradled its kind for countless generations, that the rhythm of grazing and drifting, of resting and rising with the tide, was part of a cycle as old as the sea itself. For now, it only knew the warmth of its mother beside it, the taste of kelp on its tongue, and the promise that tomorrow the meadows would still be there, swaying gently in the light. And somewhere beyond the meadow, in waters the calf had never seen, other forces moved, currents carrying whispers of change, of things that would one day reach even these sheltered forests. But here, for now, the world remained whole, and the herd returned to the cove in peace. The night after the day in the green meadows came quietly, as if the sea itself had exhaled and chosen to rest. The cove lay deep in shadow, the cliffs dark silhouettes against a sky powdered with stars. Beneath that calm surface, the herd floated in loose formation, each vast body rocking gently with the tide. The calf nestled close to its mother, lulled by the steady thump of her heart and the slow pull of her breath. Yet even in sleep, the sea spoke. The voices of the ocean were never silent, only layered, some close and small, others distant and deep. The calf began to learn them without knowing it was learning. There was the soft creak of kelp fronds rubbing together in the current, a sound like leather being bent in gentle hands. There was the faint hiss of bubbles rising from the seafloor, remnants of ancient volcanic breath escaping through cracks in stone. Now and then, a crab shuffled across a shell bed, the clatter of its movement carrying farther than sight could follow. And deeper still, there were voices so low and long they felt more than they sounded. Whales, far beyond the horizon, calling to one another across leagues of water. The notes came as vibrations first, trembling along the calf's bones, before they resolved into sound. Mournful, patient, stretching out for minutes at a time. Some calls were rich and bell-like. Others were lower, like the deep roll of thunder before a storm. The mother lifted her head at those notes, her eyes half closing in recognition. She had heard these voices since she herself was a calf, and they carried the comfort of something constant and vast. At dawn, the sounds changed. The wind returned, brushing ripples over the surface, and the hiss of those ripples joined the morning chorus. Gulls began their bright cries overhead, sharp but softened by distance, their voices tumbling across the water like pebbles down a slope. Puffins landed in clumsy splashes near the kelp's edge, their beaks clicking as they adjusted the silver fish they carried. Even the tide's movement had a voice. The gentle rush of water between rocks, the low sigh of retreating waves pulling sand in their wake. The calf began to notice the way sound carried differently here than on the open water. In the meadow, the kelp muted the world. Every noise softened, as though the forest were a hand cupped around the ear. In the open channels, sound traveled farther, clearer. The snap of a seal's tail as it dove, the hollow boom of waves striking a cliff's inner cave, the rattling cascade of pebbles stirred by a strong current. The mother guided the calf toward one such channel that morning. Sunlight slipped down in shimmering coins through the shallows, illuminating the sandy bottom. The water here had a brighter, sharper quality, and the voices of the sea rang clearer. A school of herring passed, the synchronized flick of their tails creating a faint rhythmic drumming, like hundreds of tiny brushes sweeping in unison. The calf turned its head to follow them, the silver bodies catching the sun before vanishing into blue. They swam on, passing over stretches of bare rock where limpets clung and mussels carpeted the stone in clustered blue-black shells. Each wave over the rocks made a hushed, tumbling sound, like breath moving through a flute. The calf paused to listen, the sound tugging at something wordless and curious inside it. By midday, they had reached a place where the seafloor dropped away into a deep green blue that felt endless. The mother lingered at the edge, her great body casting a wide shadow, the calf hovering beside her. From the depths below came a sound like no other, a long, drawn-out moan that shifted in pitch, ending in a rise so high it was almost beyond hearing. The calf's eyes widened, its body trembling with the vibration. This was the voice of a whale close enough to feel in the skin, and for a moment all else in the ocean seemed to fall silent. When the sound faded, the mother began to move again, leading the calf back toward shallower ground. The channel widened, and the water grew warmer, carrying the faint crackle of shrimp feeding among rocks. Overhead, the sky darkened briefly as a cloud passed, dimming the light until it returned in a silver wash. The calf followed closely, glancing now and then into the kelp for the shadows of its companions. That evening, the herd gathered again in the cove. The air was heavy with the scent of drying seaweed clinging to the rocks, and the gentle lap of the tide echoed between the cliffs. The companions floated near the mouth of the cove, their dark heads lifting to breathe in unison, each exhalation releasing a low, hollow whoosh that mingled with the ocean's sigh. The calf stayed beside its mother, listening. It had begun to recognize the distinct tone of each breath, each splash, each small movement of the herd, as if learning the soft language of its family. As twilight deepened, the sounds of the day faded. The gulls grew silent, their shapes now only faint shadows against the sky. The wind eased, and the tide stilled, leaving the cove in a hush broken only by the slow, deliberate breaths of the herd. Far out beyond the cliffs, a single whale called again, a voice stretched across miles of dark water, carrying through the bones of the earth itself. The calf drifted toward sleep with that sound folding into its dreams, a lullaby as old as the sea. It did not know yet that these voices were threads binding the ocean's vastness together, that each sound carried a story of migration, of hunger, of seasons, of meetings and partings across distances no shore could hold. But it knew this much. When it listened, the sea seemed smaller, closer, more alive, and in that closeness, for now, the world felt whole. The first hints of winter arrived not as a sudden frost, but as a gradual shifting of the sea's breath. The wind began to taste sharper, like the memory of snow carried across miles of open water. Sunlight lingered a little less each day, slipping away before the horizon had fully swallowed it. The calf, now stronger and surer in its swimming, noticed the change most in the light beneath the surface. What had been bright and jade green in summer now wore a softer, dimmer hue, as though the kelp forests were wrapped in a thin veil. The meadows themselves had altered. Many fronds had thinned, their edges nibbled away until only the thicker midribs swayed in the current. In the shallows, where waves bit hard at the rocks, whole kelp stalks had torn loose and drifted to shore in tangled heaps. The calf nosed at one floating strand, tasting it, but the leaves were no longer fresh and sweet. They were tougher now, edged with the salt of age. Its mother grazed deeper, where the kelp still grew thick, pulling at the stems with steady patience, her wide lips curling around each mouthful. The herd began to spend more time in the sheltered coves, where the swell softened and the wind's voice was a distant hum. These bays were smaller than the summer meadows, but rich enough to feed them through the shortening days. The companions moved together in a slow circuit, grazing, resting, rising to breathe in unison before sinking again into the darkening green. The calf learned to follow this rhythm, drifting in its mother's slipstream, tucking itself close when the swells rolled harder. Some mornings, a thin crust of ice formed along the waterline where the tide had retreated in the night. It clung to the rocks like pale lace, melting when the sun's first light touched it. The calf would surface near the edge and feel the air sting its nostrils, steam curling from its breath into the chill. The mother's body was a constant heat against it, her thick hide and blubber shielding her from the cold, in a way the calf instinctively trusted. The sea itself seemed to move more slowly in winter. Storms did come, sometimes fierce, with wind that drove spray high into the air and waves that broke against the cliffs in deep, thundering booms. But between storms the water often stilled, as though resting. On those days, the surface lay like glass, reflecting the pale sky in silvery sheets. The calf would rise beside its mother and see the cliffs doubled beneath them, the world above and the world below folding together for a moment. Food was still there, though the grazing took more time. The calf began to nibble more often, learning the trick of breaking kelp low at the stem where it was most tender. Sometimes small shrimp and tiny snails clung to the leaves, and these too became part of its first winter meals. The taste of milk still came each day, but less often now, replaced gradually by the green and salt of the sea's harvest. Other lives shared the winter coast. Seals hauled themselves onto the rocky beaches to rest in the thin light, their dark shapes huddled together against the wind. Sea otters floated in the kelp beds, their fur beaded with droplets, cracking open shellfish with sharp, rhythmic taps. Even seabirds, fewer now than in summer, still came and went, their calls sharper in the cold air, carrying far over the still water. The calf watched them all, its world widening in quiet increments. The nights grew long, and with them came the winter skies, black as deep water, freckled with cold stars. Sometimes green ribbons of light danced at the horizon, faint but steady, swaying as though pulled by the same currents that rocked the herd. The calf would surface in the middle of the night, lifting its head to see those lights while the water dripped from its whiskers, and though it could not name the aurora, it would remember the shape of it. Inside the herd, life was measured in breathing and grazing, in the slow shifting between rest and movement. The companions stayed close, their shadows always within sight. The calf had learned each of them by their shapes, by the way they moved through the kelp, by the deep note of their exhalations. It was a language of presence, spoken without sound, and it kept the calf tethered to safety. Some days brought harder winds and swells that turned the water cloudy with sand. On those days, the herd stayed deeper, letting the storm rage above while they grazed in the dim light. The calf learned the feel of those changes, the way the pressure shifted in its bones, the way the sound of waves grew louder and more hollow in the distance. It would press closer to its mother then, her bulk a wall against the push of the current. By the heart of winter, the kelp forests were leaner than they had been in summer's fullness, but the herd knew where to find what they needed. They moved slowly from one sheltered bay to the next, feeding in long, patient stretches. The calf grew stronger on these journeys, its strokes more confident, its dives deeper. It had learned to graze without rushing, to lift its head in rhythm with the tide, to rest in the lee of its mother when the swells came high. The sun began to return, almost without notice at first, lingering a little longer each afternoon, spilling more light into the bays. The ice at the tide line grew thinner, and the smell of the air changed, touched with the faint green promise of new growth below. But for now, winter still wrapped the sea in its slow embrace, holding each wave, each sound, each breath, in a kind of suspended peace. And in that peace, the calf slept often, its dreams filled with the swaying of kelp, the deep notes of distant whales, and the steady, unwavering presence of its mother beside it. Outside, the cold sea moved around them, patient and unhurried, waiting for the next turn of the tide. Winter's grip had not yet loosened, but the calf had begun to notice more movement in the world around the herd. Life in the northern sea did not retreat entirely when the cold deepened. It only shifted its rhythm, moving in ways that fit the season's quiet pace. The calf, growing more curious with each passing tide, began to pay attention to the other shapes and shadows that came and went through the water. One morning, as the sun was only just beginning to spill pale gold over the cliffs, a dark shape passed beneath the herd, quick and sinuous. The calf flinched closer to its mother, but the shape was already turning back, rising toward the surface. It broke through in a shower of droplets, a harbor seal, its sleek body gleaming in the morning light. It rolled once, almost playfully, before slipping back into the green. From below, the calf could see the shimmer of its fur, the way light danced across the seal's back as it twisted in the water. It had a different kind of grace than the slow drifting of the sea cows, faster, sharper, like a flash of wind compared to the steady pull of the tide. The mother did not react beyond a slight flick of her tail, and the calf understood. This was no danger. The seal passed them twice more that morning, each time gliding close enough for its curious eyes to meet the calf's before darting away toward the rocky shallows. In the days that followed, the calf began to notice more of these neighbors. Sea otters floated in the kelp beds, often on their backs, using their forepaws to crack open shellfish with sharp clacks of stone. The calf would watch them from a short distance, fascinated by their dexterity, the way they rolled and tumbled with the swells without losing their grip on a meal. Sometimes the otters would peer back at the calf with round, bright eyes, as if equally curious about the slow giants who grazed in the same waters. Seabirds, too, remained part of the winter coast's company. Gulls drifted in loose flocks above the water, their calls slicing through the stillness. Puffins, fewer now than in summer, still paddled through the coves, their orange beaks a spark of color against the muted greens and grays. Once, the calf watched as a puffin plunged into the water, wings beating like flippers, chasing a flash of silver that turned out to be a small fish. It vanished into the bird's beak with startling swiftness, and the puffin rose again in a rush of bubbles. Sometimes the herd crossed paths with animals the calf could not fully see, only sense. One afternoon, grazing in deeper water, the calf felt a tremor pass through the sea. A moment later came the low, resonant call of a whale. It was close enough to feel, the sound pressing gently against the calf's ribs, yet the whale itself remained hidden in the blue beyond. Another call followed, longer, rising in pitch before fading, like a story told to the water. The mother paused in her grazing to lift her head, listening, before continuing on. The calf understood that not all neighbors were meant to be seen. Some were only meant to be heard. There were smaller creatures, too, woven into the fabric of the kelp forests. Schools of tiny herring flashed in sudden unison, darting around the herd like streams of quicksilver. Crabs scuttled along the seafloor, their legs ticking softly against the rock. Jellyfish drifted through the water like pale moons, their tentacles trailing in delicate threads. The calf learned to steer clear of those, following the subtle shifts in its mother's path as she moved around them. On still days, when the water lay calm and the air was without wind, the voices of these neighbors seemed to travel farther. The crackle of feeding shrimp sounded like the gentle snapping of twigs. The wing beats of diving birds thudded faintly through the water. Even the distant splash of a seal leaping from the sea to the rocks could be heard, its echo rolling across the cliffs before fading into the winter air. Not all encounters were brief. One day, while the herd grazed along the edge of a kelp meadow, a pair of young seals began to circle them, darting in and out of the fronds. They seemed to be playing a game of approach and retreat, coming close enough to nudge the kelp swaying near the calf before twisting away in a burst of speed. The calf, caught between shyness and curiosity, eventually swam toward them. For a few moments they circled one another, the calf's movements slower but steady, the seals darting and weaving, leaving trails of bubbles. It was the first time the calf had joined in such a game, and though the seals soon vanished into the deeper water, the memory of their playful energy lingered. The companions of the herd watched these meetings with quiet detachment. They had seen many seasons and many neighbors pass through these waters, and their way was not to chase or confront, but to share space in quiet agreement. The calf was learning this too, that the sea was wide enough for many kinds of lives, each moving to its own rhythm, each leaving its own mark on the water's story. As the days lengthened by small degrees, the winter light softened, spilling farther into the coves. The calf, now taller at the side of its mother, swam with more confidence among the neighbors of the coast. It could distinguish the quick shadow of a diving bird from the longer sweep of a seal's body, the flicker of a fish from the drifting pulse of a jellyfish. The voices of the sea, the clicks, the calls, the distant booming notes were becoming part of its memory, a background music that seemed as constant as the tide. And though it could not yet know it, these neighbors, too, were part of the greater weave that held the northern seas together. Their presence filled the winter with motion and sound, shaping the calf's first understanding of the ocean as a living, breathing world. Soon, however, the familiar would begin to change. Subtle shifts, barely noticed at first, would stir the waters, and the calf would learn that even the most constant-seeming rhythms could be touched by something new. But for now, winter still wrapped the coast, and the herd drifted peacefully among friends, each breath rising into the cold air like a soft plume of smoke. The change began so softly that the herd did not notice at first. It was not a storm, not a sudden noise, not even the shadow of a predator moving through the water. It was in the way the currents felt, warmer in strange places, colder in others, as though the sea had begun to stir in its sleep and turn over. The calf sensed it in moments, not as something alarming, but as something unfamiliar. A different taste in the water, a shift in the way the tide pulled. Winter had been steady, predictable. The herd had moved between sheltered coves, grazing in long, patient arcs, their breathing slow and unhurried. But now, as the days stretched longer and the sunlight grew stronger, the water carried new scents and sediments. Some mornings it tasted of faraway places, of open seas beyond the calf's reach, faint, almost floral currents from the south, mingled with the mineral tang of melting ice from the north. The kelp beds, too, began to respond. At first, their fronds grew brighter, their tips turning tender and gold with new growth. The calf enjoyed these soft leaves, snapping them easily between its lips, feeling the sweet, fresh taste burst on its tongue. But soon, in places where the current grew too warm, the kelp's edges turned pale and limp, breaking away before they could ripen. The herd moved around these patches, searching for the strong green stands that had always been there before. Some of their neighbors seemed to notice as well. The seals spent more time in the outer waters, their sleek bodies visible only in quick glimpses before they vanished into the swells. The seabirds' calls carried differently on the wind, sharper, more insistent. Even the otters, usually content to float in the kelp beds, began to drift farther, as if following something the herd could not see. One afternoon, the herd swam through a channel they had used many times before. The calf recognized the path, the way the rocks rose in shadowy towers on either side, the low hum of water passing between them. But today, the current pressed harder than usual, funneling through the gap with a restless energy. The water swirled in tight spirals that tugged at the calf's tail, urging it forward faster than it wanted to go. Its mother stayed close, her body a steady wall against the pull, guiding it through with slow, deliberate strokes. When they emerged into the wider bay, the water settled, but the taste of it was strange, saltier, richer, as if it had traveled quickly from somewhere far away. In the evenings, the wind brought a new sound from the horizon, a low, distant rumble that was not the voice of a whale, nor the crash of waves against cliffs. It was deeper, more constant, and though the calf could not name it, it stirred something uneasy in the spaces between its breaths. The companions did not quicken their pace or change their grazing, but they lifted their heads more often, their dark eyes scanning the water, as if listening for something far beyond the herd's reach. The days grew warmer still, the light lasting longer into the evening. The calf noticed that in some coves the water no longer felt cool against its skin, it was mild, almost soft. The plankton blooms came earlier, clouding the water in green swirls that blurred the view of the rocks below. Small fish gathered thickly in these blooms, their silver sides flashing, but the kelp here grew sluggish, its blades heavy and torn. The calf chewed a frond and found its flavor dull, lacking the crisp freshness of the kelp in deeper, cooler bays. One morning, the herd traveled farther than usual, moving toward a place where the kelp forests had always been abundant. The calf swam ahead, eager for the sweet young leaves it remembered. But when they arrived, the meadow was thinner than before. Many of the holdfasts had loosened from the rock, their fronds drifting lifelessly in the swell. Sunlight poured through the gaps where the kelp had been, turning the seafloor into open, bright sand. The calf nosed through the floating strands, puzzled by the emptiness where it had once hidden from the open water. That night, the current shifted again. From the south came warmer water, carrying scents the calf had never known. Oils from far-off shores, faint traces of unfamiliar plants, even the faint musk of animals it had never seen. The mother stayed close, the curve of her body pressing the calf gently toward the calmest part of the cove. Around them, the companions moved slowly, their breaths breaking the surface in steady rhythm, their silhouettes rocking in the dim light. The next morning brought a sky streaked with thin clouds and a sea that seemed to hold its breath. The calf followed its mother into deeper water, where the green faded to blue, and the voices of the kelp meadows fell away. Here, the sound of the ocean was different, open, resonant, as if the water itself were listening. A whale's call rose from far below, carrying the shape of a song that was longer than the calf's whole life. It echoed in the water for what felt like minutes, then faded into silence. The mother turned then, leading the calf back toward the shallows. They passed through patches where the water felt cooler again, cleaner, as though it had come straight from the northern ice. But the calf noticed something. These cooler patches were smaller now, scattered like stepping stones in the larger, warmer currents. The paths between them were longer, and the warmer water pressed in from every side. Even so, life continued. The herd grazed where they could, finding enough in the deeper beds to keep them strong. The calf still played in the shallows on calm days, chasing fish that darted just beyond its reach, rolling in the sand until its skin tingled. But in quiet moments, it felt the change. Not as a sudden danger, but as a slow bending of the sea toward something it did not yet understand. And far beyond the reach of the cove, beyond even the paths the whales traveled, there were other forces at work. Winds shifted, ice melted, and currents carried more than just water. They carried the first threads of change, weaving them into the places the herd had always known. Those threads would grow, tightening over seasons, drawing new shapes in the ocean's story. For now, the herd rested in the fading light, their breaths rising in small silver clouds above the still water. The calf pressed close to its mother, listening to the tide, not knowing that the currents it felt tonight would one day carry shadows it could not yet imagine. The first shadow came in the distance, long and narrow, gliding over the surface where the horizon blurred into sky. At first, the calf thought it was another drift of kelp torn loose in a storm, the kind that floated for days before washing ashore. But this shape moved differently, steadily, against the wind and tide. The companions noticed too. They lifted their heads one by one, their nostrils flaring as they drew in the air. No one swam toward it. They simply watched until the shape slipped behind a low swell and vanished. Days later, another appeared, closer this time. The calf rose beside its mother and saw it clearly. Wood, dark and weathered, riding high on the water. Along its sides, strange shapes moved, standing upright, their heads bent toward the sea. The calf could not understand what they were, only that they were alive and unlike any seal, bird, or whale it had seen before. Their movements were quick, their outlines sharp against the sky. One of them raised something long and thin to its shoulder, pointing it toward the water, but the herd had already begun to sink back into the kelp shadows. In the days that followed, the sea's surface seemed to hold more of these dark silhouettes. Some were small, with only 1 or 2 figures aboard. Others were larger, their bellies cutting through the waves with deep, slow strokes. They came with the tides, disappearing for days before returning in greater numbers. Sometimes they stayed far out, drifting beyond the kelp beds. Other times they slipped into the bays, their hulls creaking, their shadows falling over the shallows where the herd grazed. The calf began to associate them with new sounds. There was the rhythmic slap of wood against wave, the groan of ropes straining against the wind, and sometimes a sound sharp enough to split the air, a crack that echoed off the cliffs and sent flocks of seabirds wheeling into the sky. When that sound came, the companions would gather close, their bodies pressing together as they moved deeper into the kelp. But it was not only the sound or sight of the boats. The water itself changed in their wake. It tasted different, carrying scents the calf did not know. Oils, smoke, and something faintly metallic. Where the boats had lingered, the water sometimes felt heavier, clouded with drifting fragments that sank slowly to the seafloor. The calf nosed at one of these once, but its mother guided it away before it could take it into its mouth. One afternoon, the herd grazed along the outer edge of a kelp meadow when a shadow fell across them. The calf looked up and saw the hull of a boat above, its underside dark and curved like the belly of some massive creature. Figures leaned over the edge, pointing down into the water. Sunlight flashed from something in one figure's hands, and the calf, startled by the glint, darted closer to its mother. The herd turned as one, moving deeper into the green, their movements slow but purposeful, their bulk hidden quickly among the swaying fronds. Even when the boats were gone, the shadows seemed to linger. The gulls followed their paths, crying in sharp voices, diving after scraps thrown into the water. Seals sometimes trailed the boats for hours, their sleek heads bobbing in the wake. And the herd, though they returned to grazing, lifted their heads more often now, watching the horizon with quiet, searching eyes. The calf's dreams began to change. In sleep, it no longer dreamed only of kelp and whale song, but of shapes gliding over the surface, blocking the sun. Sometimes in these dreams, the shapes reached into the water, their shadows stretching long enough to touch the herd. It would wake with its mother's body warm beside it, the water calm and familiar again, yet the image of those reaching shadows would remain. The companions were not restless, but there was a new caution in their movements. They grazed deeper, lingering in places where the kelp grew, thickest, where the sunlight broke into fractured beams and the surface above was no longer clear. When they surfaced to breathe, they stayed low, their nostrils just breaking the water before slipping under again. The calf learned this too, sensing the unspoken rule: remain unseen when the shadows are near. Still, the boats returned. Sometimes they drifted close enough that the calf could hear voices above, low, muffled sounds, rising and falling like the calls of seabirds slowed to an unfamiliar rhythm. These voices carried no threat on their own, but they were always followed by movement, by the shifting of figures, by the glint of sun on metal or wood. Spring came quietly, but it did not erase the shadows. If anything, the longer days seemed to bring more of them, the water's horizon speckled with shapes moving in patterns the calf could not predict. Some passed without slowing, their sails full of wind, their shadows racing ahead of them. Others lingered, dropping heavy shapes into the water that sank with a splash and a hiss, followed by the slow rise of bubbles. The calf began to understand that the sea was not only shared with seals, birds, and whales. There were others, these creatures on the water, moving with purpose, carrying with them sounds and scents the calf could not name. They were not like any other neighbors. They did not drift or dive. They approached, and when they came, the herd watched them the way they might watch an unfamiliar current, one that could either carry them forward or pull them somewhere they did not wish to go. One evening, as the sun set behind the cliffs and the water burned with a copper glow, a large boat passed close to the mouth of the cove. The calf and its mother floated in the shadows near the rocks, watching it. The figures aboard moved slowly, their shapes outlined against the fading light. For a moment, the calf thought one of them turned its head and looked directly into the water, directly toward them. It held still, even its breathing quiet, until the boat slid on and its wake faded to nothing. That night, the herd rested close together, the sound of their breathing mingling with the soft lap of waves. But even in that calm, the calf could feel something shifting. Not in the tide, not in the wind, but in the pattern of the sea's surface. The shadows were coming more often now, and each time they passed, the ocean seemed just a little less the same. The shadows that had once appeared only now and then were no longer rare. They came with the tide, not as a single passing shape, but in twos, in threes, in clusters that dotted the horizon from morning until dusk. The herd no longer had to wait for them to arrive. They were simply there, part of the water's surface now, as constant as the wind. The calf, grown through the winter into a sturdy young swimmer, had never known a season without them. Yet, even so, it sensed that something about their presence was different. The change was clearest near the shore, where once the beaches had been silent but for the cries of seabirds and the slap of waves against rock, there was now movement. Strange figures gathering in groups, their shapes quick and angular against the pale sweep of sand. They carried long poles over their shoulders, baskets in their hands, bundles wrapped in cloth. Smoke sometimes curled upward from the shore, thin threads that caught the light before dissolving into the wind. The herd kept its distance, grazing in deeper kelp beds and slipping quietly into the bays only when the tide covered the sand. But from afar, they could hear the new sounds that drifted out over the water. Not the deep calls of whales or the sharp cries of gulls, but the rise and fall of voices, many at once, overlapping, sometimes breaking into sudden bursts of laughter, sometimes sinking into low murmurs. The calf would pause in its feeding to listen, the strange rhythm of those sounds settling in its memory like an unfamiliar song. Boats moved in and out of the bays with a purpose the calf had never seen before. Some carried bundles that glistened wet in the sun, dripping water as they were lifted ashore. Others brought piles of something pale and fibrous, stacked high until the boat seemed nearly to sink. When the boats left again, they often carried different loads: boxes, barrels, nets coiled like sleeping snakes. The kelp beds closest to the shore began to feel the change first. In some places the fronds were torn or cut, drifting away long before the herd could graze them. In others, strange shapes floated just beneath the surface: ropes, poles, and heavy frames that clinked faintly in the swell. The calf swam too near one once and felt the brush of something firm against its side, unlike any rock or kelp it had known. Its mother steered it away, her great body a shield between it and the thing that hung in the water. Even the seabirds seemed drawn to the new activity. They gathered in wheeling flocks above the bays, diving to snatch scraps thrown into the water, or chasing each other over the sand. The air above the shore rang with their cries, mixing with the sound of human voices until the two became inseparable. The calf would surface and hear that mingled chorus carried on the wind, a constant reminder that the shore was no longer the quiet place it had once been. One morning, the herd moved cautiously toward a familiar cove, only to find it crowded with the dark hulls of boats. Figures leaned over the sides, hauling something heavy from the water. The calf could not see what it was, only the way the shapes strained and pulled, their voices rising in shouts as the thing broke the surface. Whatever they lifted, it was alive. It thrashed and twisted, scattering spray before it vanished into one of the boats. The calf felt the sudden churn in the water, a vibration that carried through its skin and pressed closer to its mother until the herd turned away. From that day on, the herd began to keep to the outer meadows, far from the bays where the shore bustled with life. But even there, they could not escape the signs of change. Sometimes small boats ventured out beyond the kelp beds, their shadows falling over the grazing grounds. The figures aboard would lean over, peering down into the green, their hands trailing in the water as if searching. Other times, the herd would find floating scraps, planks, ropes, and odd pieces of wood, drifting where no storm had been to break them loose. The companions grew more watchful. They surfaced less often in open water, staying low among the kelp. When they traveled between grazing grounds, they moved in tighter formation, the younger ones pressed between the larger bodies. The calf learned to follow the smallest movements of the herd, the slow turn that meant a change in course, the quick flick of a tail that meant to sink deeper. But the shore did not grow quiet again. Each day, more figures appeared on the sand, their movements quick and certain, as though they knew the patterns of the tide and the ways of the water. The calf, watching from a distance, felt a strange pull, part fear, part curiosity. It wanted to know what the voices were saying, what the bundles held, why the boats came and went in such steady rhythm. But the mother's slow, deliberate movements reminded it that some things were better left unseen. And yet the presence of the shore's new life pressed outward, filling the sea with its echoes. The calf could feel it in the water itself, in the faint hum of activity that traveled through the swell, in the altered taste of the currents that swept out from the bays, carrying with them traces of wood smoke, salt, and something else it could not name. The sea was changing, and the shore was at the heart of that change. Still, the herd drifted on, grazing where the kelp was thickest, resting in the quietest coves they could find. But each time the calf surfaced, it glanced toward the land. And there it was. The movement, the voices, the smoke, the endless coming and going of the shadows on the water. And in the stillness between tides, when the sea lay flat as glass, the shore seemed almost to lean closer, as if the world of the land was reaching for the world of the sea. At first, it was not clear when the number began to change. The herd still moved through the meadows, still grazed in long, slow lines, still surfaced together in soft exhalations that hung in the cold air. But in some mornings, the calf noticed spaces where another body should have been, a gap between companions that felt like a missing note in a song. The mother did not speak, for there were no words to use, but her movements told the calf something was different. She swam more slowly now, often pausing mid-meal to lift her head, listening. The companions did the same, their great dark eyes searching the green depths before moving on. It was not the way they had grazed in the winter, when the kelp swayed thick and the herd's presence felt solid and unbroken. There was an emptiness now, faint but growing. Some of the missing might have moved farther along the coast, to other feeding grounds the calf had never seen. That was what the calf wanted to believe. But the meadows near the shore felt changed. Patches cropped down to bare stalks, fronds torn and drifting, strange objects lodged among the holdfasts. The boats had been there often, their shadows gliding over the water, their figures leaning down with hands and tools that reached into the sea. Once, the calf and its mother swam into a cove they had visited many times before. The water there had always been calm, the kelp tall and sweet. But now, the kelp was ragged, its fronds lying in tangled mats along the rocks. The scent of the water was wrong, sharper, tinged with something metallic. And the herd that had once filled this place with the sound of grazing was gone. Only the tide moved, pushing the torn leaves back and forth in silence. The calf stayed close to its mother, unsettled. Even the seabirds seemed to notice the difference, their calls sharper, their wings beating low over the surface as they searched for scraps. A lone seal surfaced near the edge of the cove, looked toward the calf, then slipped under without a sound. The water closed behind it as though nothing had been there at all. In the days that followed, the herd traveled more often to deeper meadows, far from the busy shores. The water there was cooler, the kelp stronger, the currents quieter. But even in these places the calf saw fewer shadows among the fronds. Sometimes they would pass a lone sea cow grazing by itself, a shape the calf recognized from the winter season. Yet, when it tried to swim closer, the figure would drift away, vanishing into the green before the calf could reach it. At night, when the herd rested, the calf sometimes dreamed of the missing. In its dreams, the meadows were full again, the kelp swaying against a backdrop of countless shapes, each breathing in time with the tide. But in the dream's end, the shapes would fade one by one, their shadows slipping into the deeper water until only the mother's form remained beside it. The companions grew quieter as the season turned. They no longer played at rolling in the sand, or lingered near the surface for long breaths beneath the sunset. Their movements were purposeful, their grazing steady but restrained, as if each meal might need to last longer than the one before. The calf felt this unspoken caution and mirrored it, staying close, moving when they moved, feeding where they fed. One afternoon, the calf spotted a disturbance in the distance. Boats gathered in a small bay, their hulls rocking gently as figures moved between them. The herd turned away before coming too near, but the calf saw enough. Ropes trailing into the water, bundles being hauled over the sides, shapes moving just beneath the surface before vanishing into the boats. The sound of voices carried faintly over the wind, quick and urgent, unlike the easy rhythm of the tide. By the time the herd reached the next meadow, the calf's thoughts still lingered on what it had seen. It tried to push the images away, focusing instead on the taste of fresh kelp, on the cool rush of the current against its skin. But the absence was harder to ignore now. The herd's breathing, once a full and steady chorus, seemed quieter, the intervals longer between each rise to the surface. Even the whales' distant songs felt changed. They still came, deep and resonant, vibrating through the bones, but now the spaces between them were wide, as if the sea itself was listening for something that did not return. The calf surfaced beside its mother one evening, watching the fading light spill gold across the waves, and wondered if the ocean noticed the missing as much as it did. The meadows remained beautiful in their own way. Sunlight still filtered down through the green, still turned the sand to gold in the shallows, still lit the bodies of fish that flickered between the fronds. But the beauty felt thinner now, stretched over something the calf could not name, a hollowness beneath the familiar. And in that hollow, the absence of certain breaths, certain shadows, was as clear as the tide's pull. The herd did not stop moving. They followed the currents to where the kelp was thickest. They rested in the quietest bays they could find, and they kept close together in the dim hours before dawn. But with each passing week, the spaces between them seemed to grow. and the calf, though still young, had begun to understand. Not all who left the meadow returned. The sea was still vast, still full of life, but the calf could feel the shift. The fewer tales there were in the kelp, the more the water seemed to echo. The morning came pale and quiet, the kind of light that seems to hesitate before touching the water. The herd floated in the stillness, their bodies swaying with the slow rise and fall of the tide. The calf, now grown into a young adult, lay alongside its mother, the curve of their backs catching the first faint gold of the sun. The sea was calm, but the air held a stillness that felt like the pause before something changes. They began to move together, not with the urgency of flight, but with the steady, unbroken pace that had carried their kind for countless generations. The companions followed in loose formation, their shadows moving like great drifting stones beneath the surface. They were heading toward a meadow they had known all their lives, one of the first the calf had grazed in, one of the richest in memory. The path took them past quiet coves and over sandy channels where the sunlight pooled in wide, glowing ripples. Here and there, the calf caught sight of neighbors, a seal resting on a rock, an otter drifting on its back. But there was no interruption, no play today. The sea felt different, as though every sound had been muffled. Every voice softened to a whisper. Even the distant cries of gulls seemed reluctant to carry across the water. When they reached the meadow, the calf saw that it was thinner than before. The kelp still swayed, its green still glowed in the light, but large patches of the seafloor lay bare, the holdfasts torn away. The water here was warmer than it should have been, the current softer. Yet it was still beautiful. The way the light bent through the swaying leaves, the way fish darted in brief flashes of silver, the way the shadows of the herd moved as one across the sand. The mother swam ahead, her great head dipping as she grazed, the movement slow and deliberate. The calf followed, matching her pace, taking in every detail, the ripple of her hide in the current, the trail of bubbles that rose when she exhaled, the way the sunlight broke into 1,000 pieces across her back. They drifted together through the meadow, pausing now and then to rest, their bodies side by side in the gentle swell. There was no hurry, no rush to reach the far end of the feeding ground. The swim itself seemed to be the point, each movement a quiet remembering of what it meant to belong here. The calf found itself looking more often toward the edges of the meadow, toward the open blue where the kelp ended. It could not explain why, only that the space beyond seemed heavier than before, as though it held something waiting. As the day passed, the tide turned, drawing the water out toward the open sea. The herd shifted with it, not leaving the meadow entirely, but letting themselves be carried along its edges. The calf swam close to its mother, feeling the strength of her body against the pull of the current. The companions moved in a slow arc around them, their presence steady, the rhythm of their breathing like the deep drumbeat of the sea itself. Near sunset, the light turned copper, painting the kelp in shades of fire. The herd rose together, their backs breaking the surface, sending soft ripples outward. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke from the shore. In the distance, a few dark shapes moved against the fading horizon, boats, small but clear in the golden light. The calf saw them but did not turn away. They were far enough for now, their presence only another shadow in a day already full of quiet. The mother took a long breath and began to move again, leading the calf toward the far edge of the meadow. The water here deepened, the light dimming to a rich green blue. The kelp thinned, replaced by soft fields of seagrass that swayed in the fading light. The calf followed, its body moving in time with hers, the two of them gliding together as they had so many times before. In that moment, the sea felt endless and close all at once. Every sound, every current, every shimmer of light seemed sharper, as though the world was leaning in to remember. The calf felt it too, that this swim, this path through the fading meadow, was not just another day's journey. It was something final, though it did not yet know in what way. They swam on until the last of the sun's light slipped beneath the horizon, leaving only the silver of the moon spilling across the waves. The herd slowed, drawing closer together, their shadows merging into one dark shape beneath the stars. And there, in the quiet space between one tide and the next, the young sea cow stayed beside its mother, knowing without words that every movement, every breath, was part of something they were carrying together. The moon was high when the tide turned, its silver light washing the water in a soft, unbroken glow. The herd drifted together in the stillness, their breathing the only sound in the calm night. The young sea cow floated close to its mother, feeling the quiet pulse of her presence. There was no wind, no swell, only the slow, steady rise and fall of the ocean's chest beneath them. Morning came without hurry. The sun lifted pale and low, its light scattering over the surface in shifting shards of gold. The herd began to move again, grazing along the meadow's edge where the kelp still grew thick. But something was different. The companions were fewer. The spaces between their shapes seemed wider, the rhythm of surfacing breaths less full. No alarm broke the calm, no sudden splash, no chasing predator, no rush of fear through the water. It was subtler than that. One day, a familiar shadow simply did not rise beside them. Another day, the gap between breaths lengthened until it became a silence. The young sea cow looked for them in the kelp, in the quiet coves, in the open blue beyond the meadows, but found only the gentle sway of fronds and the slow drift of plankton in the light. The mother swam steadily, her path deliberate but unhurried. She did not search, and yet she knew. The companions who had swum beside her for seasons were gone. Some had drifted away into other waters, others had vanished in ways the sea could not explain. Still, she grazed where the kelp was richest. Still she surfaced to breathe in the morning light. Still she guided her calf through the quiet lanes of the meadow. The water itself seemed to carry the absence. In the past, the kelp beds had trembled with life, tails brushing fronds, bodies shifting in slow arcs, shadows crossing one another in the green light. Now, there were long stretches of stillness, places where the only movement came from fish threading between the leaves. The young one swam through these silent spaces with a feeling it could not name, sensing that something here had changed forever. Even the whales' songs felt altered. They still came from the deep, long and resonant, but there were fewer of them now, the pauses between notes stretching wide as the horizon. The sea, always full of sound, seemed to listen more than it spoke. The cries of seabirds drifted in from the shore, mingled with the creak of boats moving in and out of the bays, their hulls carrying shadows across the water. One afternoon, the mother led the young one to a shallow cove they had not visited in many tides. The water here was clear as glass, the sand below pale and fine. But the kelp was gone. Only scattered holdfasts clung to the rock, their blades torn away. The young one swam slowly through the emptiness, its tail stirring fine clouds of sand. It could hear the sound of the tide moving over the rocks, the occasional snap of a shell cracking open far below, but there was no familiar rhythm of grazing, no warm exhale of another sea cow nearby. They lingered there only a short while before turning away. The mother's great body glided ahead, her movements slow but steady, her shadow stretching long in the pale water. The young one followed, glancing back once at the silent cove before it vanished behind a bend in the rocks. As the season drifted toward its close, the herd, what remained of it, stayed in the deeper meadows. These places still held the rich green of healthy kelp, the currents still cool, the leaves still full of the sea's salt-sweet taste. Yet even here, the spaces felt larger. Grazing no longer filled the water with the same quiet chorus. The breath of each remaining companion stood out clear against the hush. The vanishing was not a single moment. It was a slow tide, a gentle ebbing that took place across days and nights, across the turning of moons. No one cried out, no one thrashed or fled. It was simply that where there had been many, there were now few. Where the water had been heavy with presence, it was now light. The currents free to move unbroken between the fronds. Still, life went on in small ways. The otters cracked shells in the kelp beds, the seals traced the shoreline in playful arcs. The gulls wheeled over the coves in search of fish. The young one learned to graze longer without rest, to find the tenderest kelp at the meadow's base, to rise for breath in the smallest space of open water. It learned, too, to carry the silence beside it, the way the sea carried the memory of waves long after they had broken. And in that silence the gentle vanishing continued, soft as the pulling back of a tide, leaving the shore bare and gleaming under the sun. The days had grown long again, yet the meadows felt emptier than the young one had ever known. The currents moved more freely now, carrying the sway of kelp in wide, unbroken arcs. Where there had once been the constant presence of other great bodies grazing, breathing, drifting together, there was now space, a space that seemed to hum with a memory the water could not quite let go. The young sea cow swam beside its mother through one of the oldest grazing grounds. The kelp here was still thick, the leaves strong and green, yet their swaying seemed slower somehow, as if they knew the herd that had once fed among them was nearly gone. The mother moved with her usual grace, but her pace was unhurried even for her. She paused, often, letting the currents carry her before dipping her head for another slow mouthful. The young one mirrored her, not from hunger but from the quiet need to be close. The few remaining companions stayed near, moving in loose but constant formation. When they surfaced, the sound of their breaths rose into the air like small clouds, each one distinct in the calm. The pauses between those breaths seemed longer now, as though the sea itself were slowing its heartbeat. Even the gulls wheeling overhead seemed to cry less, their calls scattered and thin. One morning, a fine mist lay over the water, the air cool enough to touch the skin with a soft bite. The herd drifted together, their shadows long and pale beneath the surface. The young one could not see far in the dim light, but it could feel the nearness of the others, the warmth of their bodies in the water, the quiet thrum of life that still bound them together. It was a comfort, but also a reminder. There were fewer heartbeats now, fewer shadows to follow. The mother led the way to a secluded cove, one the young one remembered visiting in its first season. It was unchanged. The same narrow entrance between the rocks, the same still water inside, the same kelp beds swaying in the hush. But there was no one else here now, no other grazing shapes in the green light. The two of them moved slowly through the kelp, each bite of leaf deliberate, as though this meal were not just to feed the body, but to anchor the memory of feeding at all. As they rested in the shallows, the young one drifted into sleep. In its dreams, the sea was full again. The meadows crowded with the slow movements of the herd, their breaths breaking the surface in a steady, familiar rhythm. It dreamed of swimming among them as a calf, brushing against their warm sides, feeling their shadows cover it like shelter. But even in the dream, the shapes began to thin, slipping one by one into the deeper blue until only the mother's form remained beside it. The water held them in a vast quiet, and the young one woke to find the dream had matched the truth. The days became gentler, not because the sea had grown kinder, but because the herd had slowed to its own rhythm, moving little, grazing where the kelp still thrived, resting long in the calmest bays. The young one felt the mother's presence more than ever, each turn of her body, each deep pull of her breath. There was no fear in her movements, only a deep and abiding stillness, as if she were making peace with the currents that had carried her since birth. One evening, as the sun sank low and the sea turned to molten copper, the mother led the young one to the outer edge of the meadow. The water was calm, the horizon open and wide. They floated there for a long while, the light deepening from gold to rose to the soft gray of twilight. When the moon rose, its silver path stretched across the water, touching them both. The young one thought the sea had never felt so quiet. The mother's movements grew slower in the days that followed. She grazed less, surfaced less, and lingered longer in the shallows. The young one stayed close, pressing against her side as they rested. It sensed the change without needing to understand it fully, knew in some wordless way that the mother was beginning a journey it could not follow just yet. On a morning when the mist lay thick over the cove, the mother drifted into the stillest water and did not rise again. The young one swam around her, touching her gently with its head, but she did not move. The current carried her slowly, her body rocking with the tide, and the water around her seemed to hush even further. It was not a sudden thing, not sharp or frightening. It was like watching a great shadow settle into the sand, like seeing the tide slip away from the shore. The young one stayed beside her until the current carried them apart. It swam to the mouth of the cove, looked back once, and then turned toward the deeper water. The meadow was empty now, but the sea still moved, the kelp still swayed, and the light still touched the surface in golden shards. The herd was gone, yet the sea carried their presence, in the quiet of the meadows, in the taste of the currents, in the slow rhythm of the tide. And the young one swam on, carrying that presence within itself, as though every heartbeat was part of the ocean's own memory. The sea holds memories the way the wind holds the scent of rain, never tightly, but never letting them go. Long after the last Steller's sea cow had vanished from the kelp meadows, the water still moved with the rhythm of their passing. It was there in the hush between tides, in the sway of fronds that brushed the current as if waiting for a wide, gentle body to pass among them. Seasons turned over the northern waters. Winters laid their silver skin across the sea, and summers poured gold into the shallows, and still the kelp grew, swayed, and was eaten, though not by the bristled lips of the giants who had once grazed there. Seals darted through the meadows now without pause, no longer skirting the slow-moving shapes that had once filled the green corridors. Otters floated where the sea cows had rested, curling in the cradle of kelp leaves that once brushed against massive flanks. The shore, too, changed. What had been small gatherings of people became settlements that clung to the edges of rock and sand, their smoke curling into the air year-round. The boats grew larger, their sails and masts standing high against the horizon. Nets and ropes hung drying along the beaches, and the cries of gulls followed them, just as they had followed the first arrivals. The sea still came and went with the tide, but its voice was mingled now with the steady hum of human presence. Yet, in the deep coves, away from the busy shore, the memory of the sea cow lingered. In certain light, when the sun fell low and the water turned to hammered bronze, the shadow of a broad back could seem to glide just beneath the surface. It was only the wind, or the play of light, or the rising swell, but to those who looked closely, it felt like a presence. On calm nights, the air still carried the soft, hollow sound of a great breath breaking the surface, though no shape followed it. The kelp meadows themselves seemed to remember best. They grew thick in the places where the herd had once fed, sending up leaves as if expecting the slow, methodical grazing that had shaped them for generations. Without the gentle harvest of the sea cows, the fronds sometimes grew too long, tangling together until storms tore them loose. They drifted ashore in great mats, carrying with them the faint scent of salt and life, the same scent that had once clung to the hides of the giants. Whales still passed through these waters, their songs winding through the deep like long threads of history. And sometimes, in the pauses between verses, there came a note that seemed older still, a low, almost imperceptible hum that was not quite wail, not quite wave. Those who listened closely might imagine it was the echo of the sea cow's breathing, carried forward by the ocean's own memory. The people who lived along the shore told stories. Some spoke of creatures so large they could carry a child on their backs, gentle giants that had no fear of man and no weapon but their weight. Others told of how they had vanished, taken too quickly, as if the sea itself had not been ready to let them go. A few claimed they still saw them on certain nights, slipping through the kelp when the moon hung low and the wind was still, a shadow where no shadow should be, a ripple where the water should have been calm. And so the Steller's sea cow lived on, not in flesh, but in the sea's own recollection. The currents still curved around empty spaces, as if to make room for their bulk. The tides still moved in time with the slow, steady pace of their grazing. Even the fish seemed to dart and swirl in patterns shaped long ago by the passing of their great bodies. On some evenings, when the sea was glass and the air was clear, the water would take on the color of old memory, soft, deep, and endless. The waves would roll in with a sound like slow breathing, and the light would bend in such a way that the meadows below glowed with the green of another time. In those moments, it was easy to believe that the herd was still there, drifting through the kelp, unhurried and unafraid. The ocean has no need to hold time as humans do. It does not mark beginnings and endings in the same way. It keeps everything, folding it into the currents, letting it surface when the light and tide are right. And so, somewhere between the sway of kelp and the song of whales, between the pull of the tide and the hush of the wind, the Steller's sea cow still moves, still grazes, still breathes. The waves remember, and in their remembering they keep the giants alive, forever part of the sea's quiet, endless story,